other electronic devices. So let's begin with the introduction of the candidates. They are, beginning on your left, Gus Pedrati, Timothy Keller, Susan Wheeler Dykesel, and Brian Colon. Candidates Ricardo Chavez, Michelle Garcia Holmes, Wayne Johnson, and Dan Lewis are unable to participate this evening. We're going to hit the ground running tonight. The candidates have already participated in multiple forums, so we're going to dispense with their usual introductory remarks and go straight to the first question, which I have written here, if I can point out. To what do you attribute the spike in crime in Albuquerque, and what do you think the city and APD should do about it? And we will start with Mr. Pedrati.
1 minute. Okay. Where do you start with this? There's a long history of excessive force and abuse from the police department in our communities that's actually led to an adversarial dialogue between the public and the police department, and now neither of us are supporting each other, them and their actions for the community, us and respecting them as a utility that we do need and need to improve. This goes back to the Hyde incidents where we had Ray Schultz, then police chief, respond in such a forceful manner to that tragedy that we never recovered. Previously, before that, we were contracting to the Cops TV show, escalating, showing off all of these violent acts to try and gain more money. Policing for profit never works. What do we do then now? What we have to be sure is that we as a city have to complement services moving forward. That's why I'm proposing a small clinic care model that's a service-first idea that's been proven through Project Echo in the community to try and support our officers and not make them be behavioral health professionals anymore, because we know that excessive force was specifically also related to behavioral health issues. Furthermore, this allows them to focus their resources in returning to community policing. We're going to finish up the DOJ mandate, get total new cops, and more of them.
Thank you. Please, I really do ask that you don't applaud. It just takes time from our candidates. And I also want to ask if you would all just please sit to answer the questions. We try to put everybody on a level playing field here. So anyway, the next question, that question now goes to Mr. Keller.
Well, I'll build on, I think, what Gus mentioned and just say a couple of additional factors, because this is such a tough question to do in such a limited time. So, I think there's two things that are really important. Where we're at today is not by accident. It is not a national trend. It is the reflection of choices that we made several years ago. And I think that's very important, because I think as mayor, I want to change those choices so that we get out of this problem that we're in. And one of those has to do with the fundamental basis in which we run our police department. And it used to be around community policing. I remember as the state senator right here in the International District, when we would meet once a week in our neighborhood and we would talk about things going on in our neighborhood, and the police would act and then follow up and come back to us. We have gotten completely away from that, and we have to get back to that. That, to me, is the fundamental philosophy. It's a fundamental set of policies and procedures. It should be the anchor with which around APD is built, and that's what I want to do as your next mayor.
Thank you. Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
Yes, thank you. There's nothing that either candidate before me has said that I don't think are excellent ideas, especially the small service model, also going back to community policing, resuming that model, being very, very mindful of the idea of using all the high-tech tools that are available out in the policing world today, and all of the service tools, small service models such as Gus Pedrati has mentioned. Those are extremely important, but also high touch. High touch and community policing brings about the possibility of building back trust and allowing for very high trust among individuals, business owners, residents of the city of Albuquerque. We must resume that model if we have any hope of taking ourselves back. And where it came from everything they said, and also from the economic decline, a lack of hope, a lack of promise for the future. Thank you.
And Mr. Colon.
The spike in crime is related to several items. We can never have this conversation if we don't talk about the underpinnings of crime in Albuquerque. It's a lack of resources. It's a lack of resources for behavioral health issues, mental health issues, drug addiction, reintegration programs. We continue to put people in the bad circumstances they were in before they were a first offender. If we don't change the world in which we put people in when they take them out, we will continue to have the same end results, which is repeat offenders. We have to make a deep commitment to stopping and breaking the cycle of crime in Albuquerque. We talk about a revolving door, but if we're not going to put resources there, none of us are going to be able to put our foot in that door. So we have to address these underlying issues. And the overarching issue, whether it's in Albuquerque or coast to coast, there is a direct correlation between deep poverty and crime. So if we're not talking about those 4 issues as it relates to crime in Albuquerque, we're kidding ourselves. So for me, it's about focusing those resources. It's about bringing constitutional community policing to Albuquerque.
Thank you all for that round. I know it's hard for some of you guys to sit down, but I have to tell you, once I moderated a mayoral forum where one candidate, it was very contentious, and one candidate jumped up and another one jumped up, and anyway, we want to try to avoid that. So
Susan never gets violent, I promise.
I know she won't. They've gotten to know each other quite well, I think. We're going to start this round of questions with Mr. Keller. And it's a long question, but I'm going to read it all. An effective chief of police is crucial for successful police reform. What qualifications do you consider most important in a chief? What specific steps would you take to recruit a chief with the right experience, energy, and leadership qualities to do the job? And what measures will you use to monitor the new chief's performance? You have a minute and a half.
So where I would start is this. You know, I think number one, the chief has to be focused and have experience in and be an expert in community policing. And to me, there are major issues we've got to solve, but the issue that the chief has to solve is the culture, the policies, and procedures at APD. And to do that, they should all be driven by community policing philosophies. Now, the other thing is, I do think the chief should have some experience in our community. I know that we need an outsider, so I think the chief should not be somebody from within the department, but I also do not think it should be a stranger who is not familiar with our community and our diversity and our uniqueness. And in terms of measuring performance, for me, I love finance, I love data, I'm a numbers person, but I also think there's some basics. I want to have a long wait list to be an officer at APD. And I want to have a decline in use of force cases. I don't want to have any questionable shootings. I know that's a high bar, but these are the kinds of, at the end of the day, outcomes that really reflect all the underpinning issues around that. But most importantly, I want our community to trust APD, and I want our APD to trust our community. If we can stand up and both sides can say that, we've been doing the right things. And that's what I want the chief to be responsible for, and we'll hold them accountable for.
Thank you. Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
With respect to choosing the chief, I would consider a possible candidate from anywhere around the country. I think ideally, one who's familiar with our community would be really great, would be an excellent possibility. But I believe that the chief is going to need to be chosen by a committee made up of citizen stakeholders, citizens who come from various interest groups, such as APD Forward, because they are such a broad coalition. And when they have gone through applications and have come up with the most positive candidates and gotten it down to 3, I would like to have those presented to me as mayor, and then I'll make the decision. But one of the criteria that's most important for me is that whomever that chief may be, from under our noses or from around the country, that chief has to have drank the the CASA Kool-Aid, as I call it. They need to believe in the outcomes of this, the positive outcomes of this settlement agreement as much as I do. If they're not as committed as we are, then they're not going to be someone that I would consider for chief.
Thank you. Mr. Colon.
For me, the number one quality is being a leader. We haven't received clear signals and messages from the administration of the city of Albuquerque as it relates to the DOJ oversight. We haven't received clear signals from our chief of police that we are interested in coming into 100% compliance with the court-approved settlement agreement. Let me say that again, court-approved settlement agreement, which means parties were around the table. I'm an attorney. I've signed off on plenty of settlement agreements. The parties say these are the items that we will conform with. Unfortunately, we haven't received clear signals from the leadership in Albuquerque that that's our goal. So for me, it's about leadership and being able to say, yes, we're going to do this. It's about making sure that somebody has a familiarity with our community. So what I've been very consistent in saying since January 25th when I announced this bid for mayor, we will have a national search with a local focus. It's going to have to be somebody who's interested and who has experience in building a department that's been decimated with special units, with numbers, sheer numbers, and understands what constitutional community policing is. We have to have somebody who is going to be comfortable with community engagement. And that leads me into the selection process. We will have a very transparent and engaged approach. The problem with the current administration is there's been total lack of engagement in the community. We will have APD Forward represented, we'll have the APOA represented, we will have a search committee that represents Albuquerque so that you can assist in choosing the next leader for our police department. No more spokespeople. Every night I turn on the news, I've got a different spokesperson. The chief will be the spokesperson right besides the mayor for Albuquerque Police.
Thank you. And Mr. Pedrati.
I think getting a chief that focuses in on de-escalation is a cornerstone of any community policing, but to be specific about that, that's something that we need to address, especially since our DOJ mandate was related to excessive force. I also believe we need a national search. This is a culture change. It might take something from outside of our current status to actually bring it around. That being said, you can be not from Albuquerque and be sensitive to the needs of our communities and the broad strokes about identity. I would be very interested to ask all candidates for police chief what it is diversity means to them and how it's represented in communities, alongside then how policing can be oppressive and abusive towards marginalized groups, and how laws can also be structurally and systemically abusive. If a police chief can answer these questions, then they also know what to look for when moving forward with sensitive communities. That's incredibly important because we can't go back to the old law and order dialogue. Furthermore, they have to be able to make the harsh firing, and that means that if there are miscommunications that we've seen in this department, if there are cover-ups and if there is corruption, then they fire every single person down to where the corruption occurred. They're going to play hardball with this because we can't move backwards. Furthermore, they will get to bring in their command staff to ensure that these cultures change. We're going to get rid of the APD command staff. And then also, we're going to make sure that they can use new ways to communicate their needs and what they expect out of this department. When you look at departments that have turned around like LA, New York, and Boston, they actually use really great interior communication to better strengthen the bonds of police officers, create a unified message, and move that out towards the street. Lastly, that we're going to be sure that they're responsive to all oversight board requests.
Thank you all. We'll start the next round of questions with Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel. The APD Forward Coalition represents diverse communities across Albuquerque. Those include Native Americans, people experiencing homelessness, LGBTQ individuals, and people living with mental illness. What's your experience working with these communities, and what will you do to help build trust between them and our police department?
Thank you. What a thoughtful question. I have had no specific one-on-one experience working with any of those communities, although I was once a homeless person myself when I was much younger. Due to poverty, thank goodness, it had nothing else, it had nothing to do with mental illness. But one thing that I know is that I'm a person that was raised to be inclusive, and I am inclusive. And if nothing else, I will make sure that all communities are invited to the table and asked to give me the input to me as mayor so that I can then make sure that our police chief and our entire police force is engaged in the same kind of thought. That's going to do it. That is absolutely going to do it for us here. We must be completely inclusive.
Thank you. Mr. Colon.
For me, I take a lot of comfort and pride in knowing the communities that I'm passionate about. It's usually communities of color. And I tell people that the lens I look through is one of the lens that many of those underrepresented communities look through. It's a lens of poverty. It's a lens of growing up on commodities, blocks of cheese, powdered milk, Section 8 housing, and not having a single blood relative in the entire state from the time I was a teenager. Because see, I had to bury my father when he was 49 because he died from muscular dystrophy. So when you talk about people who are marginalized, you're actually talking about my family. You're talking about the community that I came from. I sit here today because community filled the gap for me and I didn't fall through the cracks. That's part of why I run for mayor, because I owe a debt to the community, a debt that I can never repay, but I'm going to die trying. I've got a long-standing record of inclusion, working with race equity tools, making sure those that don't have a voice at the table do have a voice, making sure that when we talk about benefits for programs, we also talk about burdens for those who are not present. You have to talk about inclusion. I've advocated my beautiful sister. I gave her away at her first wedding and her second wedding to her wife. No, I'm just kidding, I'm just kidding. And her third, no, I'm just kidding. I love my sister. But I have been deeply steeped in these issues of inclusion for a very long time. When I graduated from UNM School of Law, one of my #1 priorities was to bring diversity to the bench in the city of Albuquerque. Frankly, it was a bunch of old white men. Not today, and I'm grateful for that.
Thank you. Mr. Pedrati.
So it's no secret that as especially a white male, I carry extreme amounts of privilege throughout this community and in this country. And I don't feel comfortable sitting here and listing experiences to try and tokenize to or shirk that privilege. But I did grow up here, went through Albuquerque High School, and also then worked with Project ECHO. Project ECHO was a small clinic care and telehealth care group that changed how they deliver services, especially to hepatitis C. Terrible illness, often related to heroin and opioid addiction crises, and then obviously is related to socioeconomic status as well. And so through the models I'm proposing to change how we deliver services into communities, it's at the root of helping communities that have previously been disserviced by what we're trying to do. There are so many barriers to access what we are trying to give communities or what communities are trying to give themselves. We need to decrease those barriers so that they can get better access. If you don't have access to services, you're never going to get them. That's why when we see that there are upwards of, or up to 7 points of contact for a publicly intoxicated person, normally again from a lower SES bracket, we can see that we can actually renovate that system to have less points of contact and provide them more quickly to the care that the community is already giving. This is also easily seen when we talk about how we connect people to social and behavioral health services related to when they're also sobering up off of a substance. We have to approach people with their context, and policing alone can't do that. It has to come through new service side support. Protect and serve, and the city needs to do more service.
Thank you. And Mr. Keller.
Well, this is an important issue for me, and I believe that actually what's inherent in that question is what we're actually going to do about it. And I think all of us care deeply about this issue. But for me, it's about how do you institutionalize some of this? And so for me, I'm going to create a, not just believe in race equity tools, I'm going to use them. And the first one I'm going to use is shining a light on every level of government at City Hall and at the police department. And we're going to compare that to the community on gender and ethnicity lines. And we're going to measure our progress towards race equity and city government parity and APD parity. That is a real way to actually make sure that our government reflects our community. And we're going to publish that, we're going to make it public, and you can hold us accountable every year for meeting that goal until we actually get there. The second thing is I'm going to make sure all the leadership at APD is conversant and they understand things like white privilege. And I appreciate what Gus said. They also have to understand that we need cultural competency training in the police academy and by every officer. And that we've got to understand our traditional communities and their history, and that should be part of training at APD. And also, I'm going to make sure that it's clear that we are going to stand up for all our families. That includes our immigrant families, that includes our refugee families, that includes our undocumented families. That is what every city employee is going to stand for under my administration.
Please. We are going to start the next round. It's your turn, Mr. Colon. As mayor, how will you ensure that APD reforms are implemented and endure beyond the end of the settlement agreement with the Department of Justice?
That's really the most important question, because where do we go from here? Let's come into the 300 recommendations and requirements under the CASA, 300 plus. But how do we make sure that once Department of Justice goes packing and we don't have to spend $150,000 a month for compliance issues, where do we go from there as a community? I'm uniquely situated to bring the parties to the table to have true reform. The only way you have true reform is to rebuild trust. The trust has been severely broken between APD leadership and the city leadership and rank and file women and men on the streets of Albuquerque. It's also been broken between APD and the community. Due to the nature of my work over the last 16 years, I've encountered officers on a very regular basis. A lot of good women and men that serve our city. The lens I look through is one where I've defended those officers. The law firm I work with, yes, has defended APD officers. I think that gives me a certain amount of credibility and capacity to bring them to the table for true reform, because they know that my deep commitment is to benefit the city. It's not to be an advocate or zealot for one side or the other, but rather how do we really have constitutional community policing in Albuquerque? The other side of my life is 20 years of community engagement, whether it's with organizations that advocate for people who don't typically have a voice in this community, or whether it's in organizations like United Way, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Metropolitan Homelessness Project, Albuquerque Heading Home, all the organizations that I've been honored to work with over the years. That gives me capacity and credibility.
Thank you. Mr. Pedrati.
So DOJ is a binary situation. It's either done or it's not. And if it's not done, then we're going to keep paying out these dollars and we're going to keep creating an adversarial mentality in our communities. What we can do, though, to take the politics out of this, to take the politics out of policing as a whole, is ensure that the DOJ actually becomes completed by a court-appointed special master. This is very important, I believe, and it can even start while there's an interim police chief to get skin out of the game there. That means that a new police chief can come in with a ground zero, that we've complied with everything that we know was doing wrong, and they can go back to an entirely community policing-based model to move us forward. It won't be the fact that it's DOJ compliant alone that moves our police department forward. It's what we do after that. It's who we get to become once this is behind us. And for me, that's why it's so important to, even in the short run, because we know we're going to have to do educational changes within the academy. We know we are going to have to hire more police officers and get to that optimal number sensitively. How do we start doing that now? Again, I believe the service-first model is a way to get officers outside of having to be behavioral health professionals or be social workers, and instead delivering community care more quickly. This is incredibly important because, again, when we look at the DOJ mandate, it came from behavioral health issues, from our poor response to those situations. We need to get police officers out of that interaction as a long-term structural change. Because if we don't find better ways to serve these communities, we might go right back into that settlement.
Thank you. Mr. Keller.
Well, I think the question about how we're going to get these reforms done is really important. And so, to me, there is one big high-level issue, and then there's a lot of details. The high-level issue is this. If I happen to be your mayor in December, I am not delegating this to anyone. It will be unilaterally the mayor's responsibility to finish the DOJ reforms, and that is the single biggest issue that's been missing historically. That's also what has held up DOJ reforms in other cities, and the reason why they've been finished in other cities is because the mayor draws a straight line and says it is the mayor's responsibility to get these done. The second thing is the mayor cannot be afraid to get into the details. And if you look at these reports, what Dr. Ginger is saying and others, I mean, there are 3 different data sets on use of force, and we can't even get a straight answer from the department. They failed 20 out of 20 tests in terms of compliance on use of force, and we are still arguing about use of force 18 months later. As mayor, we're going to go in there, and I will make a decision on use of force policy for APD that will be in compliance with the DOJ, and that'll work for APD, and then we're going to move on. And then we're going to finish the rest of the forms, and we're going to send DOJ home, and we're going to take back our department in a much better place. That's what we need to actually get these reforms done.
Thank you. And Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
Thank you. We will complete the Department of Justice Settlement Agreement. It won't be within the 4 years. I'm sure it's going to have to be extended to at least an additional year, but we will complete it, and we will be one of the cities that does not have to revisit that because we're going to give our officers new training, new tools, and we're also going to educate our communities in how to better interact with police. But one of the things that cops have been asking me about is ways that they can access 24/7 services that they can refer the people that they service, which largely 92% of the people that cops are called out to take care of are people with behavioral mental health crises or health crises. And sometimes they can get them service and sometimes they can't. It just depends on who's available when. We need to have an app, we need to have sources for cops to be able to use to best serve their communities. But one of the other things that we can do to make sure that slowly our community just becomes a better place that won't get into that again is we need to work on our zoning codes. We need to include inclusionary zoning. For those of you who don't know what it means, please look it up. Inclusionary zoning will optimize the possibility that people of all income levels live just right next to one another, and we won't have to have the stratification of our communities that we've had.
Thank you. We will now begin with Mr. Pedrati for the next round. Lapel cameras are a critical tool, but are not always being enforced. How will you enforce this program?
First, to touch briefly on special masters, because I know that was brought up again. They have worked in other communities. It helps make it so that there isn't politics around the police force, and also the DOJ mandate is actually ultimately up to the city council. It's a cooperative endeavor. Even Dr. Ginger has mentioned that. And so when we think about the responsibilities of each role in government, we have to be clear about what each person is doing. It's a community effort, and a special master helps make sure that we distribute that burden and we get to full compliance. About body cameras are incredibly important. It comes down to accountability and access to information regarding a job that affects all of us, and especially a traditionally abusive environment. There are ways that we can mitigate that. Obviously, there's great officer strain when they say, I'm watched 24/7 and this is hard and it makes me overthink actions. And at one hand, yes, you are constantly watched. You should be, this is important. Your actions always matter as a representative of our community and as a utility in our city. Secondly, that's also a lot of data, that's a lot of information, that's a lot of storage, that's a lot to go through, that's a lot of capacity on humans. There are also ways that body cams can be activated whenever a tool of force is deployed out of a utility belt. There are ways that we can help mitigate that between interactions where we're sure that we need to see what's going on, and also when it's on just normally, like dash cams can help also subsidize that lapel camera action. At the end of the day though, if we can't hold any of our city utilities accountable, we're going to lose in the long run. So for me, body cams and access to that footage is a simple yes.
Mr. Keller.
Well, I think there's a couple of pieces on this, and maybe I want to work the other direction in terms of part of the problem is Taser. And I will tell you, I came out and held our last police chief accountable for his dealings with this company, and this company continues to rip us off and sell us shoddy cameras. So we're going to do that bid process differently to start out with. But I think more importantly to the question is this notion of transparency and accountability. And this speaks to me, one of the fundamental drivers of a lot of problems inside APD. And it's around consistency of procedure and discipline. Officers are continually given new instructions and new technology, and they get different instructions each time and depending on the situation. And then when things don't go that way, the discipline is based on inconsistent favoritism, possibly even corruption. This is the thing we have to fix. And the amazing thing about this question is this is a perfect example of a larger systemic issue that is deep down in the HR weeds, but a mayor has to know about and has to hold accountable and has to fix. Because all these issues, even use of force, are related in some way to inconsistency and transparency of the procedure for use of force, and inconsistency in terms of internal affairs, and inconsistency in terms of discipline. That's got to be on the mayor's radar. It's got to be a huge issue for the chief. The rules of the game have to be clear to the public and to the officers. Then we can actually get down to day-by-day policing, which is where we should have been in the first place.
Thank you. Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
Thank you. Right on, Mr. Keller. Actually, Mr. Pedrati as well. Body cameras are one of the most important tools that modern policing utilizes, and they do need to be used consistently where policy dictates that they will be used. But policy must dictate this, and this is one of the many things that we're addressing through the Department of Justice Settlement Agreement. We need to figure out when it's appropriate to use them, how they will be used, and then if they are used or not used, appropriately or inappropriately, then there have to be remedies for those kinds of misbehaviors on behalf of police officers that really mean something. This does get brought up a lot in conversation, that it's just possible that there still is remaining down there a level of corruption that's not obvious to the rest of the world in an open place, but in fact, it really still exists. The Department of Justice Settlement Agreement is partly designed to root this out, and when we finish it, let's hope that the culture of our police department and the culture of our population around our police department has then moved forward enough that we won't have to deal with that anymore. I intend that we will not.
Thank you. Mr. Colon.
So about a decade ago, I was an advocate for recording custodial interrogations. When we talked about the debate for custodial interrogations, we also agreed that it was not just about transparency, it was not about credibility, it was not about integrity only. It was about all those things, but it was about something more. It was about making sure that both sides of that conversation could feel confident that it was appropriately represented there forward. Meaning, it may be the person that was custodially interrogated that wanted that recording, but it's also been helpful for law enforcement to have those tapes. If we're going to create a safe city, it's not just the community that has to feel safe. Officers have to feel safe doing their job. And we need to make sure that we understand it's a two-sided coin. If we're going to have a safe Albuquerque, we have to protect our community, but we also have to make sure that we provide a safe work environment for our officers. I'm a supporter of the lapel cams. The disappointing part of this story is that we've lost faith. We've lost faith because the trust has been broken. It's the year 2017, and you're going to tell me we have to have a conversation about whether the backup video is actually complete or it's been tampered with? I don't have to be a forensic accountant or videographer to know whether it's been tampered with. It's 2017, folks. But we ask the same question 3 times. Why? Because trust has been broken. So you've got a PIO speaking to camera, and none of us believe that PIO. Sin vergüenza. What a shame.
Thank you all. You know, we do have a few empty, we do not have enough seats for all of you here, but if some of you would like to make your way to some of these empty seats, we could take just a moment to do that. I hate to see everybody standing like that, or if some of you could move toward the center, that would be helpful. This is a very good turnout tonight, and I'm told that this auditorium seats about 300 people, so we've got a very good crowd. Any of you standing along the side want to? Plenty of seats in this 3rd row here. Okay. The next round of questions will start with Mr. Keller. The current mayor recently announced a plan to reduce crime in downtown Albuquerque in response to concerns from the business community. Would you keep his plan in place and explain why or why not?
You know, this recent plan, I think, is another telltale example of what the mayor's been doing to solve crime, which is a press release and a one-off pilot project that's going to be over in 6 weeks. Look, at the end of the day, we've got to address all of the issues that we've been talking about, but I think specifically what we've created is a situation of sort of PR whack-a-mole. So it's like crime pops up in downtown and the mayor comes out and does a press release. And then it pops up in the other end of town. And then we've got, auto theft over here. And then we're going to use data. And then, what's missing is actually owning the problem. And this is why we've got to get back to some of the basics of block by block, precinct by precinct community policing. We should have officers who are well-staffed and have enough officers to do this. So we have officers who have a downtown beat.
And they're on bicycle and they're on foot and they're there for several years, so they get to know the community. And they're able to work these problems over the long term. And there's detectives who also are familiar with what's going on in downtown. That is a 1990s model of policing that we have completely gotten away from. And instead, in the name of basically saving money, we have continued to chase crime all over town. We cannot do that any longer. We've got to reset how we do things on a block-by-block basis. Then we can actually hold folks accountable over the long term instead of just for a few weeks and a press release. And I'm out of time.
Thank you. Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
Yeah, it was particularly depressing the morning I read the headline about Lavu finally getting the mayor's office attention. I walk those streets downtown all the time. We live downtown. They don't frighten me, they sadden me. And I understand that when you park downtown, which I don't do much because I walk downtown or bike, our cars are vulnerable, but we are as individuals. The other thing I do is I take the train. And invariably when we get back to the station from Santa Fe, which is where we usually go, we walk through groups of people who are misanthropes, let's put it that way. People that probably are homeless, maybe not, but they kind of own the place and they own the streets. I think that with respect to the central core of the city, we've all kind of really had it, and it was sort of shocking to hear that now something was going to be done because of Lavu. They brought that light that the mayor's office should have. I agree that we need community police officers to stay in a place for years. They disagree. Their Police Officers Association says that they have various reasons that they need to be rotated out with some regularity for their own safety and for other reasons. I really want to sit down with the Police Officers Association and other stakeholders to see if we can't figure out a way to make this city safe.
Thank you. Mr. Colon.
I couldn't disagree more with the approach. Lavu sends a letter to the mayor's office, CCs the governor, and all of a sudden we have a TAC plan? Are you kidding me? 99-degree seafood, donut mart, free range, all within 48 hours begged the mayor's office to do something about crime on Central Avenue. You know what they got? The same thing I'm getting from you, crickets. Nothing. No response, no empathy, no plan of attack. Why? Because they're small businesses. All of a sudden, Lavu sends a letter, copies the mayor. Now we have a TAC plan with battalion gear in the streets, with a lift on the corner of Central and First, an observation deck, really? Is that the solution? Absolutely not. The way you address crime in a city is a citywide TAC plan. You have to have area commanders that have an approach that is reliable, that has a defined outcome strategy. 10, 15 years ago, commanders were held responsible for their area commands. Today, you don't see that. You just don't see it. We are reactionary at APD. We need leadership. That leadership starts on the 11th floor of City Hall. The chief of police is going to report directly to the mayor. I'm going to be engaged in public safety 100%. We're going to lean in on this issue because we can't address the issues of economic development and education until we bring a safe city to our community.
Thank you, Mr. Pedrati.
Press release politics won't work. While it feigned to be cooperative, it clearly was nothing that could ever get accomplished on a real timeline with what was left of the administration, and it's not something I'm interested in. But I do believe in a cooperative model, because when you talk about crime downtown, and for those of you that go downtown often, it's not organized crime or violent crime. It's crime because it's disparity, and because we've criminalized situations of homelessness. We've criminalized addiction. We've criminalized behavioral health issues in this community. And so in fact, to me, the solution downtown isn't anything related to crime. It's again about services for communities that are in need. And I like to talk about the feeling of safety downtown especially, and I like to talk about this silly little millennial thing called Pokemon Go. It happened a year ago. A year ago, there was still a crime issue in our community, but people were out and about. They were on the streets. They were engaging with each other. They were meeting people on the internet and then showing up at a corner. And they felt safe. Because public safety is also our responsibility. It's not feeling uncomfortable at disparity, but instead asking how we can do better as a city. I don't want to task our police officers with showing up and having to be those behavioral health workers, those social workers, with getting through this awful web of services we're trying to provide that aren't connected, and they have no simple one-stop because MATS isn't working and the hospitals or jails don't do it. That's why I'm so committed to a new structural service-first model. Because if we're talking about crime in downtown, we're not really talking about crime at all.
Thank you. We will begin now with Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel. And this has to do with the Department of Justice consent decree. Do you think it impedes officers' ability to serve or interferes with public safety?
The settlement agreement? Is that the question?
The consent decree.
Oh, the consent decree.
Yeah.
Do I think it, I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Do you think that the DOJ consent decree impedes officers' ability to serve or interferes with officer safety?
Okay, I get it. Good question. I've talked to plenty of officers about this, and they say yes and they say no. They say that they're really glad that it happened, and they say that they're also really resentful that the whole department was painted with the broad brush of being people who use too much force and are corrupt and behave improperly, because they're really proud of the work they do as police officers. On the other hand, they're really excited about the new training and the changes that are coming. So I think that this cuts both ways. Nonetheless, I haven't come across one yet that thinks it's a bad thing. They're all really hopeful for a brighter future for the department, that everyone I've talked to. And I agree with them. I think we need to finish this agreement to a T and perhaps exceed it.
Thank you. Mr. Colon.
This is really about culture and delivery of services. It's about delivering constitutional community policing. This settlement agreement, while when it comes to delivering services and the safety of our officers, that's only because we don't have leadership if officers are not feeling safe. It's a culture. It's an approach. It's one that says we're going to come into compliance. You're going to do your job. You're going to provide constitutional community policing in Albuquerque, and we will be there to support you. The safety issues arise from a lack of resources. The safety issues are that they've got 60 calls waiting. The safety issues arise in not having the capacity or bandwidth to provide 6 hours worth of report outs, when we could be doing a voice-activated model of reporting that many other cities, smart cities, have adopted, but we haven't adopted here in Albuquerque. We've got to get our officers back on the street. As they build relationships in the community to deliver constitutional policing, we will increase their safety and our safety. It's about a delivery model that allows them to know that we have procedures in place. When they're followed, the community is safe, and so are they. But when we are shortly understaffed, when they don't have the bare items needed to do their job, morale is down, their safety is in question. Each of you don't know this, but I will tell you, driving in a ride-along, the first one up here to do a ride-along with APD in this campaign since January. Folks have followed. Not a GPS in our officers' vehicles. Are you kidding? It's 2017. No GPS? Really?
Thank you. Mr. Pedrati.
No, I do not believe a decree impedes officer safety, to be blunt about that one. What I do believe is that the obstinate government around completing the consent decree and the lack of communication between Civic Center and the police department has bred a contentious nature between the community and the police department. I think that could be dangerous for all of us. And I also believe that, yes, the fact that we haven't supported them with resources because we did gut the police department is also a reason why that maybe their safety has been impeded. Of course they need support. How could we not give our workers tools for their jobs? And one of those being actual manpower. When you look at how understaffed we are, and you realize that we pay over $4 million out of budget for overtime, and that's how our officers are making their money, I know how poorly my work quality degrades when I am working that much overtime, and I'm not a police officer. I can't imagine what that means to our communities and their feelings of safety and their level of work. There is a basic level of support that we have to offer our police department. The safety issues, the cultural issues do not come from a consent decree that we asked for to clean up systemic issues in our police department. It comes from us being obstinate towards change.
Thank you. And Mr. Keller.
You know, I think there's some interesting inconsistencies that come out even in our own experiences. In my 2 ride-alongs, we did have 2 GPS. But I think the point that some cars don't is really, really important. And I think this money issue is actually more direct than Chief's overtime. You want to know what every officer tells me? They say they need backup. And they say the city has no money to buy new or to hire new officers. And then they say the DOJ is costing us $7 million a year. That's what's in the way. So I don't actually think that's not the DOJ's fault. That's all the challenges that we're facing, and why every month that it takes longer to do this, it actually prevents us from putting that money towards hiring officers. That's what upsets them, and that's so real. That's why we've got to get this done as soon as possible and use that money to hire more officers. It's that direct in many ways on the front line when you actually talk to an officer. That's the only real issue I've heard with DOJ. That in the time. So what they're saying is that the leadership has hung them out to dry, not because the DOJ told them to do anything, but because they said, oh no, the DOJ's here. If you have any use of force, you have to do 13 pages of paperwork and watch 6 videos. And instead of actually taking training on community policing and on use of force, you have to go do all that paperwork. And they're saying, you know what, cities all across the country are doing this more efficiently. And so that's why a mayor's actually got to step up and say, you know what, we're going to do the reforms, but we're also going to be respectful of the time you're spending in the back office, and we're going to use that money for more officers.
Thank you all. Mr. Colon, why do you think people experience homelessness, and how would you solve public safety issues in ways that do not criminalize people and behavior in public spaces?
Homelessness is experienced for any number of reasons. Often it's with individuals that have underlying issues of behavioral health, drug addiction, mental health issues. Unfortunately, we've seen that safety net ripped out from under us in Albuquerque. Under the administration that this state adopted when it elected Susana Martinez, she single-handedly decimated the sector that was providing services in those areas. Nonprofits that were serving those underserved communities, out of business. Why? False accusations. So we have to have leadership. We have to say that, yes, we understand these are underlying issues of homelessness. When I was a couch surfer, it wasn't because I had any of those issues. I didn't have capacity for earning. I was a young boy with not a single blood relative in the state. We all have these issues, but we all get there in different ways. What's different about a community that's safe and smart is it has the capacity to assist those individuals. When I was working with the Metropolitan Homelessness Project, I can tell you that I ran into the full gamut of individuals and why they were homeless. But I think we have to have new models. We have to have centers that provide services to those individuals to provide housing first. That housing first model is a model that I embrace. I also want to say that we ought to have programs that are being done around the country for reuniting families. Let's identify homelessness. If they have family support systems that are outside of Albuquerque, can we find a path to reunite those individuals? We've not talked about that in this community. I'm ready to have that conversation.
Thank you. Mr. Pedrati.
People experience situations of homelessness for many reasons. Oftentimes it boils down to opportunity and choice. We can't understand free will and choice as the decision between 2 desperate options, but instead as a decision towards self-actualization and things that make us feel good. When we think about all this, it comes down to, of course, economic issues, social issues, cultural issues, but the fact of the matter when it comes to decriminalizing it and supporting people in these issues, it's as simple as decriminalizing it. It's as simple as not picking people up for this or sweeping them away off a street corner and then letting them come back and then us all yelling about it again. It's us taking responsibility for all of our communities, not just the ones that feel good to in the moment. And so I like to talk about exactly what downtown looks like on Saturday mornings. We have a beautiful growers market on Saturday mornings where Robinson Park is alive and well and everyone's out. And then hours later, it looks as it was, and no one wants to go there anymore. We need to stop displacing communities for our own comfort. And this is why I'm so excited to really get to talk about this service first model. Because if we can get a one-stop where somebody can sober up that doesn't have to bounce between the hospital and mats and get picked up by a police car and a fire truck and an ambulance, and then a contracted ambulance, we can actually deliver services more quickly, use behavioral health professionals better, lean on physician's assistants and nurse practitioners to get Suboxone for people who are suffering from addiction to heroin instead of just waiting for naloxone to reverse an overdose. We can also provide clean injection sites to stop needle exchange and actually provide oversight to these issues that help contribute to homelessness.
You know, I think this question of what we do with someone who's actually on the street corner is very, very important. And I love this model, and I think to take it a step further in terms of how we're actually going to do this, it's all about these community paramedicine response teams. And the idea is that instead of calling 911 where 9 cars in the fire truck show up, you actually have a social worker and a trained paramedic who are going to deal with that overdose or that behavioral health issue. And then you have the social worker who's going to place them based on their specific story and their specific need in terms of where they need to go. That's what we've got to do. Many cities are doing this. It's also an ER diversion program because that's the last place that we should be taking these folks because of all the other cost reasons, but the other reasons in the backlog, and then they just get put back out on the street. So what do? The housing first model is so important because all those social services go into that. Right now, Albuquerque Heading Home has about 400 housing vouchers they use every year. And we say they do a great job, but we don't back it up with real money. You want to address homelessness, we've got to make different choices. Right now, we have a fountain on Civic Plaza that we're building for $4 million. For the price of that fountain, we could have given thousands of homeless people housing vouchers in the Heading Home program. Those are real choices that our government has already made. I'm running to make different choices and actually give those folks the voucher and the housing chance that they need.
Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
I agree with everything my fellows on the panel have said so far, and then some. My circumstances were that I was waiting for affordable housing. So housing first, absolutely. That wait back in the 70s was over 2 years. Ours is longer than that here. We do not have enough affordable housing. People end up on the street for any number of reasons. You all know what all the reasons are, and probably there are a few that we never even thought of. Housing first and making it available. Our Heading Home project, terrific. Not for enough people though, and not scalable in its present form. We need a variety of models to be available all the time, and absolutely to decriminalize homelessness. That's craziness. That's a waste of everybody's time and energy. The other thing, though, that I feel on a social level is that there's an awful lot of judgment around the idea of why someone might or might not be homeless and what that means, and are they less worthy of living in homes than we are. So therefore, should we not provide for them public restrooms? Let's make sure that we don't have any at all, that we deny ourselves them to make sure that a homeless population can't access them. There's lots of stuff related to this that I'd love to talk to you about if we had more time.
Thank you. Now our next question will start with Mr. Pedrati. This person says, my son has chosen to enter law enforcement and is considering applying to APD. What is your plan to recruit and retain a highly talented but diverse population of officers? We are African American and have not seen black officers anywhere.
Thank you. Please do apply. We need you. And yes, we need representation. And again, going back to talking about white male privilege briefly, these are all concepts that I could intellectually understand, but it wasn't until I ran for office as a young person that I really understood what representation meant. And so thank you for all you do in standing up for communities where people are underrepresented. Moving forward though, how can we make this a better career and a more respected one? We've talked about some of the ways that we can create a more comfortable culture to make sure that the city is supporting these services and that you get the utility you need as a police officer, but also what can you look forward to? We know that longevity pay is a must. We're gonna not just have you hop in on this current hourly rate that we have, which is actually competitive, for you to work a ton of overtime because you're young and you're ready and you can to go to another department that respects your long-term career more after 3 or 4 years. We have to restore longevity pay so that you feel incentivized to stay, that you don't have to overwork every single time to get the paycheck that you deserve. That's so important. Furthermore, again, we're going to provide services out in the community that means that you're not dealing with situations you aren't trained for. This is simple. I'm not asking you to be a behavioral health professional or a social worker. I don't want you to be those things. I want you to be a role model in the community. I don't want you to only have to show up for emergency response, but to be a known presence and someone that we look up to. And certainly I look up to you, whoever you are right now, for choosing to step up in your community today. And so by supporting the services that we're trying to offer, by making sure that you are clear in your roles and have freedom to be in that community, I think you're making a wonderful choice for our city. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Keller.
Well, I certainly would say thank you as well, as much as I could. And I would make sure that we are committed and demonstrated and can be held accountable for a police force that reflects our community. And that includes Native Americans, that includes African Americans, which are typically highly underrepresented in law enforcement, and the LGBT community, which is drastically underrepresented in law enforcement. And we're gonna put our name on that, and we're gonna manage, and we're gonna recruit towards it. Now, the broader issue of how we do this, I think, is really important, because we have to reach back into our community to create a real pipeline for officers to come in. And so I think part of this actually has to do with after-school programs. You know, we have ROTC programs in our schools. It's a club. We should also have law enforcement programs, or even for folks in the firefighter arena, they should have programs around that. And we should also have specialized charter schools that feed into this. And I want to recruit folks, hopefully from the same community, that they'll go back and police. And this was one of the most amazing things right here in the International District. When I was the state senator, we had a lot of officers who went to Highland and who went to Van Buren. That's how we should target our recruiting. But the last piece of this, I'm going to say also that our community is going to come around the officers going forward. And you know what? That also means having officers integrated into not only how we run our neighborhoods, but how we run our community. And so I will hopefully offer not just a career in law enforcement, but deep community enrichment and an experience of actually being that hero for a neighborhood that we all know our police officers are. That's the kind of opportunity that they're stepping up for.
Thank you. Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
Terrific suggestions. Please, whoever you are, ask your son to apply. I don't know if you folks remember, but a couple of chiefs back, perhaps 3, we had an African-American interim police chief who I understand was really terrific, but he got recruited to someplace else. What a surprise. I would love to see, my fantasy police department is one that's really representative of the community, but the only way that we're going to get folks from all backgrounds to apply and to want to work for our police department because it's honorable and because it pays well and it's an exciting career, that they feel that they have lots of opportunities to give back to the community and the community gives back to them, is we do have to give them proper pay and proper working conditions. Longevity pay is a must, so is it a must that we increase pay when people get promoted? They don't just get promoted to detective and nothing happens. They need to see something in their pay envelope for that. The other thing that, segueing off of what Tim Keller said, is police athletic leagues, police-centered boys and girls clubs, and we already have a program now in our high schools, available at some of them, where young people can decide that they may want to have a policing career, and by the time they graduate high school can become police service aides. So we have something here like that now. We need more of it. Please ask your son to apply.
Mr. Cologne.
So I think this is a phenomenal opportunity for our community and for our APD department. So APD is about to turn the corner. I would ask you to explain to your son that sometimes the strongest elements come out of the most difficult times. And I think we are in a rebuilding mode. One of the best times to get on board is early. We're about to create a phenomenal police department. And I'm confident that if any of my colleagues on this stage and I are elected, we will have a phenomenal police department in 4 years. Wouldn't your son love to be a part of that change? Then I would ask you, do you have a daughter? We need her too. So really, and how do we recruit those individuals, your son, your daughter? We say, look, this is not about being a police officer. It's not about having a badge and a gun. It's about being a public servant. It's about making a difference in the community. It's about being where my wife has taught for the last 17 years at Van Buren Middle School and inspiring those young children in her school, because you walk in and you're a public servant. You're a member of APD. an organization that goes back to being the gold standard for law enforcement in our state of New Mexico, a place of pride, a place of constitutional community engagement and policing. Remember, that used to be what we had here in Albuquerque. Unfortunately, it goes back to trust being broken. Let's rebuild this together. I can't rebuild it with a bunch of old white guys. I've got to rebuild it with young, motivated individuals who want to serve our community, and they better look like our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Keller, what is your opinion on the government providing excess military equipment to the police?
It's not good. You know, in the legislature, I worked on this and voted against many of these measures. I think it has set a whole wrong tone that has reinforced these cultural challenges that we've been talking about. Now, you know, there are some basics when it comes to laptops and things like this, so I think we also need to be reasonable. But the things that drive that sort of combative mentality that do not reflect a guardianship culture or a protect and serve culture, I think we need to be very, very careful with. And I think those are not only symbols, but they're tools that have been used. And that is the opposite direction in which we need to go. So I would look very closely at that and try and eliminate anything that fits that criteria in any way. I think also I would say to the officers this: it is not about the tools that you have, but there are some minor exceptions like cars. And, you know, Brian has brought up GPS and things like this. We need basics, and I do think the mayor's got to stand up and say, any department anywhere that wants to give us basic tools of the trade that we need, we absolutely want. But when it's something that reinforces any of this culture that is around the warrior culture, we're going to say no, and we're going to say that's not welcome here in APD.
Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
I don't want any federal Army hand-downs. I don't want any tanks in our streets. Actually, one day we saw them. Yeah, I'm with you. One day we saw a tank over by City Hall. I can't remember what the incident that was going on at that point, but it was horrifying. And that helped us to really visualize what it looked like. But you understand there's a larger issue here with respect to those hand-me-downs. Of course we want to take the hand-me-downs that we need or buy them new for ourselves, which would be ideal. But the federal government trying to get rid of their old stuff so that they can then buy new, so that they can then spend our tax dollars on buying more various kinds of tools for war. And so we'll send them to our police departments throughout the country. I read about Jeff Sessions talking about one of the Midwest states a couple of days ago. And we're going to send off old military equipment to there as well. We have got to somehow stop that right here and right now. Our police are not soldiers to keep us herded together or to be shooting at us or to be riding in tanks. They are part of our community. They are us. I don't want any of that stuff. Send it back.
Okay, please, no applause. Mr. Pedrati. No, I'm sorry, Mr. Colon.
Jeff Sessions, he might not know where New Mexico is this morning, but I can assure you after the lawsuit that was filed today by our Attorney General, he knows where New Mexico is now. That's for sure. So thanks for bringing it up, Jeff. So excess military equipment, look, let's not be confused with what the issue is here. The issue here is having constitutional community policing and rebuilding trust. If we can acquire equipment, look, I'm a lover of flea markets. I grew up under the table at the flea market, and I'll die at the flea market. I mean, so you give me a bargain, I'm going to be interested. So there's a difference between working with the federal government for resources that are necessary to protect and serve our community with constitutional community policing, between that and between the militarization of APD. Let's make sure we don't cross that line. It's about common sense. It's about saying, yes, we can use some assistance, we can use some support, and it can be done right without having the militarization of the Albuquerque Police Department. Instead of focusing on where that line is, what I'd rather focus on is how do we build the relationships so that when APD officers are out doing their job, our communities, our neighborhoods. My bride feels safe when she sees officers. She knows they're there to do a job, that they're there to protect and serve, and that her constitutional rights are going to be protected, regardless of the circumstances, period.
Thank
Maybe
you.
even exclamation mark.
Thank you. Mr. Pedrati.
Of course, these things depend on what they are. I think that's clear. Is it a laptop? Awesome. Does the Army have a laptop that we're interested in using? I mean, an old laptop gets old really quick. But man, if it's better than what we have already, we're really in trouble. So where do we really go, and why do we want it? Also, what does the federal government want in return for us accepting their aid? Do they want us to turn in our communities? Do they want us to turn our backs on who we are? And so if those are stipulations, then the answer is no. I don't care for it. If there are resources that we need and they're interested in just pawning it off because they need to build a new, bigger thing, then I guess we can take it, sure. I have a flip phone still, so if one of those is a smartphone, let's pass it on down. Most importantly, though, I've walked the riot lines of APD. I've stood face to face with police officers behind riot shields. I've looked them in the eye and I've asked, can they speak to me? And they shook their head no. And I understood. Of course I understood. But I also understood that in that moment, we had two people that were on the same side, sizing each other up as a threat. I understood that all of those mounted police, I understood that those armored vehicles with turrets were pointed at me. And that is something we do not go back to. That is something we do not need. It's already here. And we do not need more, we need less.
Thank you all. APD, let's see, we're going to go with Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel first. APD regularly encounters situations involving individuals living with mental illness. A robust behavioral health system is important to reduce or improve those encounters. Please assess the effectiveness of our local behavioral health system. What specific steps would you take to ensure the system provides adequate treatment and secure options? Service options, I'm sorry.
What was that word?
Service.
Service
The
options.
last one,
Okay,
what
okay.
specific steps would you take to ensure the system provides adequate treatment and service options?
I think we need to rebuild our behavioral health system from the ground up, and it need not be crime-centered. At this point in time, over 90% of police calls involve either behavioral health issues, addiction issues. And those are the people that come out to serve because that's the model we have. I'm much more interested in the small service model that Gus talks about so much. I'm all over that myself. I believe that throughout the city, we have to have vehicles, probably like large RVs, that are outfitted with behavioral health professionals, social workers, medical professionals, people that can assess folks as they are if they're out in the community. But not everyone's homeless. We have to remember that some people live in homes and some people need to be part of longer-term care, and I don't think we're doing a very sufficient job of that either, especially such as it's been broken down by our governor who's nearly finishing 2 terms, and I believe we're going to have to build it up from the state level again. I know that our services for regular users were completely decimated in the last couple of years, and we're building those back up. As your mayor, I will absolutely focus on many sides of the behavioral health issue. Too much to talk about in a minute and a half, but really good stuff to do.
Mr. Colon.
I was a substantial supporter of the Behavioral Health Initiative tax for the county. They got it right. They led the conversation. The commissioners actually provided leadership on this issue. Kudos to them. And I got to tell you that, unfortunately, in my opinion, they've taken too long for deployment. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking to Dr. Paul Hopkins and other experts in this community who I trust. And they tell me, don't worry, it's coming. And finally, in the last few months, we've actually seen some deployment for services to organizations that you and I both trust. Organizations like PB&J that serve homeless students, that serve families in crisis. It's a Band-Aid for the short period. Until we make a real commitment to addressing this issue with bricks and mortar and increased, consistent, long-term professionals in our community serving this issue of behavioral health, we'll continue to have the issues that we have in our community with people who are being put into the criminal system even though they should be put into treatment systems. So for me, it's about making sure that we're surrounded in a Colon administration with professionals, people who are experts in this area. Look, I got my finance degree and then I went to law school, and I've been practicing law for 16 years and practicing community for 20. But I'm not a behavioral health specialist. But I know there are plenty of them in this town. And we've got to make sure that they have a seat at the table when it comes to the next administration for our city of Albuquerque. I can assure you that they'll be not just invited, but they'll have a real comfy chair.
Thank you. Mr. Pedrati.
To assess the current behavioral health situation right now. Bad. What to do about it? First thing is that we have to understand behavioral health isn't just crisis, and that if we always leave it to crisis, then we will always be depending on emergency infrastructure. Because even psychiatrists, even psychologists call emergency infrastructure when things go into crisis. It has to be proactive. Much like the problem with government as a whole, we've been reflexive. We haven't actually been honest with our needs and how to provide for these things. Now, there are many ways to do it. I could tell you that there's a service-first, small clinic-based care model again, but that might sound boring. So what else can we do? And again, I'm really passionate about that one. We can also start saying that when we create these mixed development housing buildings, we can have live-ins. We can have live-in caseworkers. We can have people who can actually see the community. And this isn't unheard of. This is a simple solution for ongoing care and community health. We can actually increase the points of access to ongoing care, again, maybe through decentralized small clinics. Because you can't get through a hospital if you're worried about a status right now, if you just are on the edge. It's hard to be seen. If we have more access points to varied levels of care, to use the whole umbrella of healthcare professionals, all the way down to community care workers and peer-to-peer models, we create more jobs, more points of access, more sensitivity to context and community needs, and a healthier city.
Thank you.
You know, I think a couple of things on this. Number one, you know, in general, I support alternatives to incarceration. And I think wherever you can, the mayor's got to step up for that and break this pipeline to prison and not let MDC be our behavioral health center. But at the end of the day, I think we need to ask ourselves as a city and in City Hall, why is this taking so long? And we've been at the table. We've been talking about this for a long time. And we know what happened at the state level. But at the end of the day, I believe it's actually because the mayor hasn't stepped up in a meaningful way. It is time we act like the big city we are. And that means we should have a city-built behavioral health diversion center and treatment center. Until we actually step up and build that facility, whether it's the old Loveless or the old jail downtown, and then cooperate with all the nonprofits who do this so they can operate it, and we'll use the money that comes from the Bernalillo County health tax. That's what they're missing. I asked Bernalillo County what they're missing. They're saying the city will not step up with the infrastructure, with the actual beds. And folks who know me know I love finance. I love financial choices. And this is another one that to me is very, very stark. We could have done this last year. We could have done it the year before that. But instead, our mayor and our city council are building softball fields on 98th Street for $20 million. That is the same price to rehab one of these buildings to make the city-owned behavioral health center that we need. These are the choices that we need to do differently. These are real monetary differences that reflect an investment in behavioral health.
Thank you all. As I told you when we began, we would not be able to get to all of the questions that came from the audience. We did go through 11 of them, however. And I want to, well, we'll welcome Mr. Lewis. We're on the land. Well, he was at a city council meeting, so we will say that. I want to give each of our candidates 1 minute to make any kind of concluding remarks they would like to make on public safety and police reform. I think we'll just start with Mr. Cologne, I want to stay in the same order. And Mr. Lewis, you can have the last word. We'll start with Mr. Cologne.
Well, I'll close by saying thank you for hosting us. And I'll say in terms of public safety and police reform, we know it's necessary. We've got a roadmap through DOJ. Let's focus on it. Let's make it happen. If you're involved in law enforcement and public safety in Albuquerque and that's not your interest, then I'm not interested in having you in leadership for APD, period. We have got to get out from under this and move forward as a community with true constitutional community policing. I'm the attorney up here. I understand what that means. I understand what it is that in order to have the base, you've got to meet constitutional litmus tests. You've got to understand what case law application is. That's the bare minimum. Now, where we take it from there is exciting because then we have a police department we can all be proud of because we know that what the bare minimum is, we're actually exceeding those standards. We're actually really having true engagement with community stakeholders. We're actually building a police department that reflects our community. We're actually saying that to our young people, when you grow up, you can have a career in public safety. And we're saying to our community, if you're an APD today, I don't want you pinning a badge on a BCSO officer for your niece, nephew, daughter, or son. They need to be with APD because you're proud to be a public safety officer in Albuquerque.
Thank you, Mr. Cologne. Mr. Pedrati.
First of all, yes, thank you for having us today. And I want to talk a little bit about what public safety will mean going forward and what we've heard. There are nice words here. There are words that make us feel comfortable and are non-nuanced. One of those words is community policing. Let's not forget what community policing has done to communities. Things that have come out of community policing are stop and frisk. Things that have come out of community policing and went towards stop and frisk were things like broken glass mentalities. We have to be careful that we're not falling into these old law and order traps. And that's why I'm so adamant about providing a structural difference in how we give services to communities. This isn't policing as usual. Policing won't be the same moving forward. We can always call someone a bad guy. We need a different option now. And that's exactly what I'm trying to bring forward because the answer to fixing APD issues have been being said for 3.5 years. We aren't the experts, we've been listening. The how is there. It's 4 main things. Please find us on Facebook, dig into this model, dig into your communities. Thank you.
Mr. Keller.
Well, I think what we might need is a forum on community policing because I think we all have different definitions of that. I think community policing is a whole lot more, and I've got the manual that APD used to use on community policing that I've been going through, and I've seen it and I've lived it. And I saw what it looked like in the International District when we had the lowest crime rates in decades, and it was because of community policing. And nowhere did that have to do with stop and frisk. And it was also because we respected and we championed and we protected our immigrant communities. You have to have trust, and that means a mayor's got to stand up and protect everyone and say no to what's happening in terms of what Trump is coming down and say no to all of these policies that are truly dividing our community and that are ruining what is good about community policing. And the last thing I would say is this. I happen to be the only candidate up here who's run a government agency, and that is so important because these challenges mean hiring, firing, dealing with policies and procedures, getting down into the HR weeds. That is what I'm ready for.
Thank you. And Ms. Wheeler-Dykesel.
Thank you. I actually got skipped on the last question, but that's okay because I had one thing that I wanted to add on before I do my close, and that is that the Loveless facility on Gibson is completely furnished and equipped. I don't know if you guys knew that, but it's ready to go. The beds are already there. But I know what you mean too. We're talking about all the other kinds of infrastructure within the city. Thank you all for coming out tonight. APD Forward is doing a marvelous job, and please support all of us as we move through this process. It's got to get done, and it's got to get done well. And then we need to move this city forward. Absolutely, we cannot wait any longer for this. Morale is down. Around the city, people are feeling as if they can't trust cops, although an awful lot of that came with the most recent presidential election. But here on the ground, we who are members of the public and the police who serve and protect us have been the recipients of that distrust. We must work to change that.
Thank you. And Mr. Lewis, we'll give you 1 minute.
Thank you. I go to every single forum, but I take my job seriously at the city council, and that's the only time I've ever missed when I had a city council meeting. So thank you for understanding that. And and by the way, every question that was asked here tonight, I'll stay after in that lobby, and I'll answer every single one of those questions personally to each one of you. And if we don't have the time to do that, I'll give you my cell phone number, and you could call me, and we'll talk about it for as long as you want. I was the first public official to stand up publicly and say that we had a systemic problem within the Albuquerque Police Department, and that we needed a DOJ investigation. We're 2.5 years into that 4-year investigation or agreement, and we're going to complete it and get it done and get ahead of it. And we will build the most trusted and respected police department in the country. I also called for Chief Schultz's resignation. He resigned the next day when I knew that he was ineffective and would not be able to lead the reforms that we needed to be able to lead in this department. But we'll make this the worst place to be a criminal, this city. We'll stop nothing short of making this city the worst place and most unwelcome place for people who want to steal our cars, break into our homes, and wreak havoc in our city's neighborhoods. And we'll do neighborhood policing where our officers are known as police or as peacekeepers and not just enforcers. I'm looking forward to talking with you some more. Thanks.
Thank you all. When did someone wanted an announcement about the next candidate forum? Is it tomorrow night? Go ahead.
Friday at the Embassy Suites at 6 o'clock. There is another mayoral candidate forum with a special focus on the African American community. It's part of the NAACP Civil Rights and Diversity Conference, which is Friday and Saturday, 6 to 8 p.m.
Thank you. I want to thank APD Forward for sponsoring tonight's forum, and to all of you who helped. I have personally been moderating candidate forums for about, well, a little more than 20 years now, and this was an extraordinarily well-organized forum. I want to say thank you to the candidates for coming and your willingness to work on the public's behalf. In the current political environment, when we seem to be such a divided country, it's refreshing to see these people work so well together. And I want to quote New York Times columnist David Brooks, who recently wrote that politics practiced well is a noble profession. No other arena requires as much wisdom, tenacity, foresight, and empathy. No other field places such stress on conversation and persuasion. These candidates for mayor of Albuquerque have just completed number 22 out of 38 scheduled forums. As much as anything, this is a test of their endurance. Thanks to all of you in the audience for your desire to be informed voters. Early voting begins on September 13th. Election day is Tuesday, October 3rd. Please vote. Good night, everyone.